A great design is nothing without a design scheme. In-depth planning and development is the route and path to achieving a magnificent project. Let's look at the design scheme. Hello everyone, and welcome from me, Robin Santini, your interior design course educator. I'm so looking forward to taking you on this journey with me in today's lesson. But before we get started, let's take a quick sneak peek at our learning objectives. And we start off by developing an understanding of the design scheme. Secondly, we look at identifying what makes up a design scheme. So what components are vital to creating a design scheme? We then look at identifying the various programs that we can use when creating our design scheme. And lastly, we look at formulating your own design schemes as we dive into an example and scenario. But let's just quickly look at a quote that I think is a foundation to this lesson. The designer does not begin with some preconceived idea. Rather, the idea is a result of careful study and observation, and the design is a product of that idea. This quote is by Paul Rand, and it is a really grounding quote, and as I said, a foundation for the design scheme, which is exactly what we're covering in today's lesson. We are in lesson 5 of your module 2 on our design journey, and as you know, today's lesson is all about the design scheme. At this point in your journeys, you may be wanting to advise a client on how to revamp their office, restaurant, or even home, and you're not quite sure where to get started. Well, you've come to the right place. We're going to look at everything that you need for your design scheme and everything a design scheme offers you as the designer and the client. We look at the vital information that the design scheme provides us on our project journeys. We also cover the top tips for starting a new room scheme, as well as many other important things to consider. But before we get into the design scheme, let's take a little step back and ask ourselves if we know what the design is. What is a design? I know it sounds quite obvious, but we've covered all the process flows and points to this stage, and I want you to really understand what you're planning. What is the design? What are we actually going to be doing? In very general terms, the design is the art of creating a concept, an idea or theory, and developing that from a drawing, plan, specification, model into your final project space. Taking the concept and putting it into such a way that it can be brought to life. This is, however, a challenging process. This is where the design scheme comes to play. The design is developed further at each stage of the process on our design timeline. It's molded and shaped to create our masterpieces. I think it's important at this stage to understand where we are in our project timelines. So let's take a step back and investigate where in our project timeline our design schemes would ideally be tackled. Basically, we're wanting to determine how we actually arrived at this point. How did we get here? So we started off by obtaining our project brief. We then looked at our schematic design, which was taking our project surveys and putting them into a schematic design phase. We jumped into the concept development, which was all about our shell and our beehive and how that was implemented into our design. Then comes our design development phase, followed by the technical development or construction documentation phase, and lastly, our on-site and project handover phase. Our design scheme comes into play in the development phase in phase 4, where we develop our designs. We are creating our design scheme. You're probably wondering why we're not creating the design scheme in the schematic phase. This is because the schematic phase is where we collect drawing information, the schematics of the building. Creating the concept and design scheme is about developing our ideas, which is exactly what we're doing in the design development phase, phase 4, and that is what we're going to be tackling today. As we've learned in our previous lessons, the design starts at stage 3 as we start concept development. Drawings may be prepared for investigation purposes in our phases 1 and phase 2, but these are not generally considered designs at this point, as there's nothing solid or nothing has really been achieved by the designer or agreed on by the client. The concept development or the concept design represents the design team's initial response to the project brief. Design does not start at the beginning or even here, even though it might be a fun and exciting process. Research and brainstorming still needs to be done. Concept design is followed by design development or our design scheme development, during which all the main components of the building are described along with how they fit together. By the end of this process, the design should be dimensionally correct and coordinated correctly. We now know exactly where we are. We're in phase 4 of our project timeline, and we're dealing with the design scheme. Let's understand what the design scheme really is. So let's ask ourselves, what is the design scheme? Can anyone tell me in basic terms what you think the design scheme is? You can pop your answers into your Morpheus text box, or you can jot little notes down in your sketchbooks. What is the design scheme to you? So in essence, the design scheme is how we group the ideas and directions of the project or plan. The design scheme is a plan of what we're wanting to achieve in our final project. So your design scheme is a map of what the project is going to look like in the end. Can you see, or can you think about how much detail we need to include here? The design scheme is a vital part to our project planning phase. Let's look at the design scheme in a little bit more detail. How do we explain the design scheme? So firstly, the design scheme of the project is generally a little bit more advanced than the design brief or the concept design. The design scheme is how you plan to take your project from an up in the air kind of phase or your concept phase to your project completion phase. It's a map, in essence, for the client and other teams that are involved in your project to understand what needs to happen on the project. And that's where all the detail comes in. Depending on the scope of the project, the initial design phase can take around 3 to 4 weeks. During this time, I would be gathering design inspiration and liaising with contractors and suppliers about how we can achieve what we're wanting to create in the space or in the final project. I would be shopping around and putting together presentations and sample boards. So we haven't covered sample boards yet, but we are going to do that in the next couple of lessons. But in the meantime, sample boards do form a part of your design scheme. There have been many occasions while running my interior design business when dealing with clients who've asked me or my design team to just quickly whip up 3 or 4 different design schemes for our project proposal. So firstly, this could be for their kitchen, their entire house, or even a retail store. This is what they say people do on TV. Firstly, let me tell you how they do it on TV is only for TV. Secondly, to create one design scheme can take hours and days of hard work and preparation. Never mind creating 3 different design schemes. This could be a costly exercise for the client and also the designer. It can waste a lot of precious design time, thought, and inspiration. Part of our job when creating a design scheme is taking a whole lot of information and consolidating it. Information about the space, the budget, the function of the space, and the purpose, as well as the client's style and client's lifestyle. We combine all these elements into a beautiful, well-designed space. So as you can see, there are a lot of parameters to consider, and therefore creating 3 schemes would be an absolute nightmare. Focus on one scheme at a time and allow space for movement or change. Allow space for your client to change the scheme or add additional ideas, as opposed to focusing on 3 different schemes. So our first question at this point, how do I begin putting all of my ideas to paper when creating my design scheme? How do I make the plan of what my final project needs to become? In essence, how am I going to create the design scheme? Let's take a look at our client Sophia's office as an example. So far we've had our meeting with Sophia where we created our project brief. We've taken our project brief and used that to conceptualize what our design process and look and feel of the space was going to look like. So we now have a conceptual presentation that the client has seen and ideally has approved. Remember our document? Keep this handy as we are going to use this for today's lesson. Now we have to create our design scheme. But before we start the design scheme, we need to ensure that everything has been signed off to date. So this is a huge tip of the trade and something I cannot stress more. Sign everything off. I'm going to touch on this a little bit more later on in our lesson, but remember this, everything needs to be signed off. Remember our last lesson, we covered how to conceptualize your project and how to create a concept proposal. So let's just do a recap so everyone's on the same page, and we're going to use Sophia's office renovation as our example. We started off by adding our briefing section to the proposal. This was our client Sophia's brief for her office. So roughly we added our client's objectives and the scope. And we know that it was an existing office that needed to be renovated. And as the designer, we needed to draw up plans for her office. We needed to provide her a project brief and project scope, as well as some mood boards, and then construct her project and hand it over. Next, we covered the research section where we looked at everything about the space and the client's requirements and goals. what the client wanted to do with the space, what the style of the space was, and any restrictions that needed to be catered for. We then incorporated a mood board of the space, showing the mood and feeling that we wanted to create within the space. And obviously we touched a lot on the contemporary style and minimalist style that the client wanted to include and introduce. We then showed our concept development, which was how we generated our ideas and designs for her office space and how they progressed from what the concept was into the design that we're wanting to produce. And lastly, we added the layout plan with all of our ideas in the form of a bubble diagram. As I mentioned earlier, an important tip that we need to start and stress as we start this process: sign off all of your documents. Firstly, by this point, the client would have needed to have signed and accepted your contract and your design document proposal that was sent to them with the design brief. By this point, at least some sort of financial exchange should have been made by the client to secure your services. From here, make sure that the client or senior designer has signed off each step of the process that you have followed. This is to ensure that no one is confused about where the process and the design direction is going. A sign-off can be a physical signature on each document or an email acknowledging the approval of each document. We now know what the design scheme is, what information do we need to include on our design scheme, and what do we need to send off to our client for an approval. Here are some of the detail that you will need to include in your design scheme document. You as a designer would need to ensure that each of the elements have been created and included in your design scheme to your client. Your design scheme may include some of the following. Firstly, an idea of the space planning of the existing space and proposed space. Secondly, we would include color options or mood board and color proposals. I would also include some samples and sample finishes that you're proposing to use within your design or within your space. I would include a rough project scope, so just a rough high line of what the project or what process the project is going to take on. And then I would include some 3D renderings showing the scheme that I need to allude to, the concept that we're wanting to portray in the space. This last element of 3D renderings is not essential, but it really sells the design. But before we break each of the above headings up, a common question that often comes up at this point is, what elements of the project do I need to include when creating my project scheme? Can any of you tell me what you think we need to include in our project scheme? What parts of the project do we need to make sure are relevant? Pop your answers in your Morpheus text box if you know, or jot your answers down in your sketchbooks. What is relevant to our project scheme? So your answer that you're looking for is you need to include as much information about every aspect of the project that you are going to be involved in. So some of the areas that you want to look at are your flooring, your space planning or space development, material finishes such as paint finishes, wall coverings, skirtings, cornices. I would also include everything I need to about the kitchen, the bathroom, and surfaces, as well as accessories in these areas. I would include lighting, electrical aesthetics, as well as ironmongery, which is your handles and joinery. I would also include aesthetics such as artwork and any other detail relating to this project. So now we know what elements of the actual space need to be looked at during the project scheme. Let's break up what documents need to be shown on your project scheme presentation. We start off with our space planning element. In our space planning section of your presentation, you would need to include your floor plan, showing the existing space and the new space. This is where you indicate any walls that have been removed or added, any furniture items or placement, etc. I would show an example of my floor plan indicating my traffic flow. I would show current and proposed space. At this point in your project, you would have conducted your site survey on your project site. This simply means that the designer, you, would have gone to the project site, taken measurements, and been able to accurately draw the site in a scaled version of the drawing. We are going to be creating our very own site surveys in Lesson 2 of our Module 3, so don't worry if you're not familiar with site surveys at this point. Once you have a site survey on your project, you would have then converted that hand drawing or survey to a 2D computer-generated drawing, like I've done on the screen. and you can use this for your planning phase of your project scheme. So as you can see, there's a rough idea of the plan of the space and then little indications of what's happening within each space. So we can clearly see there's a dining room and a kitchen and then a lounge area. Adding your floor plans to your scheme is a process of creating your drawings on a computer-aided software program such as AutoCAD, Revit, or SketchUp, and then saving that file as a PDF or JPEG and bringing that into your presentation. So at the moment, my presentation is on PowerPoint, but yours could be on Photoshop or whatever other program you feel comfortable using. So when we're planning, we're making structural changes or improvements to the space. Whenever you're planning to make changes to a room, I always start by revisiting the layout to see if any improvements can be made. What are the main objectives to the space? Are we adding a room? Are we removing a room? How do you want that space to work? So we know that with Sophia's office space, we need to make changes to include 2 more desks. We need to include a kitchen area and a boardroom. These changes have been made in the layout section and the plan section, as I've shown on the screen. You need to confirm the layout first because this is your starting point and the guide to what you'll need with your design. Once you're satisfied with the design layout of your new room, you can start to focus on the design detail and how you want the space to look. Have another look at the budget and then keep it in line with what you're proposing. So let's do a quick recap. We are going to revise the layout, so have a look at your existing layout and see where any changes need to be made. We're going to confirm the layout with our client because we know this is our starting point, and we're going to focus on any detail relevant to the layout. In the plan that you're presenting, you would indicate or include all furniture items within the space. If nothing has been selected for that space yet, you can indicate it as a placeholder. So maybe you want to put a desk there. I would just draw a little desk shape and indicate desk on it. You may want to include measurements and dimensions and possibly overall space area dimensions. Some of the programs that you could be using at this point are AutoCAD, SketchUp, or hand drawings or rendering. It's totally up to you. We're going to cover how to create these drawings in SketchUp and AutoCAD towards the end of your Module 3 and 4, so don't worry if you're unsure about how to create them at this point. Next on our list of what to include in the design scheme, we have our design boards. No matter your design sensibility, whether you're a modernist, a classicist, a globetrotter, a minimalist, or a traditionalist, there is something to be said for having a very strong point of view as a designer. Perhaps no one knows this better than the designer, someone who helps the client hone their preferences into a coherent expression of personal style. The design boards and mood boards are the foundation to the presentation. You can either create a physical design board or you can create a digital design board. On your screen is a digital design board and mood board, if you will, of Sophia's office space. This simply means the board is indicating the design selections broken up into each space. So I prepared a digital design board so that I have a record of everything and I'm able to find it much easier, and I find this way of doing it a much neater process, especially for the client. So how do we create these design boards? Firstly, I start by sourcing my images. To create these boards, we need our floor plan and our inspiration images that show an idea of the finishes that we're going to use within the space. In this section, you would use your floor plan as a base, and then you would use your images to indicate any detail that you have that you're allocating to that space. So as you can see on my screen, I'm using Pinterest to source relevant images relating to my project for Sophia's office space. I'm relating everything to the style, the look and feel that I want to include in the space, right from color and texture to door handles that I want to use in certain doors or in certain spaces. As you can see, I've sourced images of grey floor tiles, a tile that I feel would best suit the space. It doesn't have to be specific, as this is just an indication of simply what color tile I'm wanting to use in the space. We have not specified which tile, but it's an idea of the concept of tile. I then save the image to my desktop to be used later. I've repeated this process for every element that I'm using in the space. So as you can see, I'm doing the same with a wallpaper. I'm having a little look at other wallpapers that may suit or fit within the space. I'm using a nice charcoal wallpaper here, as you can see. So I've repeated this with my lighting, my paint fixtures, my skirting, and any kitchen elements that I'm going to use in the space. Secondly, I take all of my images that I've found digitally on Pinterest or sketches that I've created and put them into my template. I have created a copy of this template for you guys in your summary notes, so you can download it when you get a chance. You can copy the images directly to the template and then size them to the allocated sizes. so the sizes that I've indicated on your template. So I use these images to populate my design board. This is what your design board is going to start to look like. So as you can see on the left-hand corner, I've added my accent color, my tabletops, my textures that I'm going to include on my wall. I've also included some of the textures that I'm going to put on my joinery. On the right-hand side, I've included images of lighting and furniture elements that I want to use in the space. Again, this is a rough idea of the concept of color, finishes, and furniture that I want to use. It's not an exact detail of the exact specific furniture item I'm going to use. So I haven't included codes, I've just included images. Let's take a quick sneak peek into how to add these images to your presentation. So download the template provided and use it as your base. You can see I'm adding images to my template. I've started with the plan layout in the center of the board, and I'm using my inspiration images indicating finishes, furniture, and I'm putting them around the sides of my plan. I'm also editing the text to indicate which images apply to which area. So you can indicate furniture, wallpaper, tiling, artwork, you name it, as much as you can in as neat as fashion as possible. This is different to the mood board in that the design board is more detailed. It's a more detailed element of each area and space, where the mood board gives an overall idea of look and feel. So some of the programs you may use during this phase is Photoshop. You would create your board on Photoshop or PowerPoint, and then obviously Pinterest or Google to source any of my images. Next on our list of what to indicate in our design scheme is our finishes. What finishes or samples are we proposing for the space? This is what we call the sample board. In our sample board, we would indicate what countertop are we suggesting would best suit the space. What floor finish do we think would best suit? So if we took Sophia as an example, or Sophia's office space, she wants a new floor. We know that there's a high traffic flow in the office space. There's 3 people, but she may be having customers or clients coming in and out. So what tile could we propose? Would we propose a strong tile, a heavy tile, a durable tile, what tile? So you need to think about all of these factors. If there's high traffic flow, we want a tile that will last long. So a really durable tile. Let's break the sample board section up. What would we include here? We would include any sample specifications. We need to show the client what they can expect for the project in terms of finishes and the selection. And we will do this through our sample board, so they can be digital or physical, as we know. These samples should always be brought to the client presentation. These are samples of the finishes that you as the designer think will best suit and work in the space. You can include 1 or 2 options, but I would suggest no more than this. Options are great, but too many can overcomplicate the process. As you know, these boards can be digital or physical sample boards, but they need to be included in your project scheme as well as your presentation. In this case, neither option is better. It's a matter of personal preference. But if I have to create a digital board, I will always bring a few physical sample versions with me to the client meeting. This is to ensure the client can see and feel the sample and how it reacts within the space. I may also bring any samples of tiles, plumbing, furniture, finishes, fabrics, metals, paint swatches, wood finishes, anything that I can get my hands on. Remember, it's an experience that we're taking the client through. Next, we are going to look at the project scope. This is simply a rough indication of what functions will be taking place on the project, a scope of the work that will take place during the lifespan of this project. This can be simply listed on the page and on your presentation, or can be in a separate Excel spreadsheet indicating each item in more detail. This document would form a part of a pack of the project scheme that you would send to your client for sign-off. So for example, in Sophia's office renovation project, the scope section, we would list all the scope that needs to happen during the project lifespan. So it's definitely a high line. It doesn't need to be too detailed at this point. Some of the items that we would include would be to remove and replace the flooring with a new flooring spec. Obviously, the specification will come later. Supply and install new desking or furniture. Supply and paint out the entire office. We would supply and install any new electrical points that are required. We would supply and place the new furniture in the space. And we know that she needs a new kitchen, so that would need to be supplied and installed. And then obviously the more scope, the better. But for this point, we've hit the baselines and the objectives for the client. Where are we getting this information from? Can any of you tell me where I've gathered the scope of this project from? Pop your answers into your Morpheus text box. So for any of you who don't know, we are getting this information from our project brief. Remember, we took our project brief from our client meeting. We gathered everything that we needed to do within the space, we compiled it into one document, and we've landed up with our project scope. Next on the list of what we need to include in our project scheme proposal to the client is our 3D renderings and drawings of the proposed space. These could be any three-dimensional drawings showing any type of detail within the project or the proposed space. By this stage, we've added all of our concept drawings, our mood boards, images showing ideas of what we're wanting to create. But by showing 3D views of the space, it'll really solidify our project proposal. I put renderings last because I don't always use them for every project, but I found some of my clients need them as they need to be able to visualize the space. However, when I do use them in my proposals, my clients are generally sold on my idea and it really excites them for what is to come. Your 3D renderings can be a nice insurance against unhappiness down the road because you're showing your client exactly what the space will look like when it's finished. My 3D renderings are typically done on 3D SketchUp, but you can do them on any program you feel comfortable with. Some of the other programs people use are Revit, AutoCAD, 3D Studio Max, and even you can create your 3D models by hand. As you can see in this rendering I've created for Sophia's office, you can see exactly what the design style is, what we are proposing to the client. And if we can see it, so can the client. So I'm going to show you everything you need to know about SketchUp in Module 4. We'll look at creating our own 3D models and drawings, so stay tuned. But for now, this is a placeholder of what we need to include in our project proposals. Let's start by looking at some of the handy tips when it comes to planning the space for your project scheme. Firstly, we're going to start off by planning the space. Get the plan together. Gather all your room layouts, your ideas for paint schedules, all your finishes. This is all key. It also helps to visualize the whole project and helps eradicate any lengthy building delays or elements that may pop up during the project phase. Next, focus on lighting. Get the lighting right. Lighting is crucial and key to the design scheme. The worst thing you could do when planning a space is put lighting in that doesn't perform a function or is not useful in the space. For example, if you had a hairstylist that couldn't see the customer's hair while cutting, this is because the light wasn't enough. This is a disaster. Position lights according to the function. This is key. Next, we need to focus on making the space a little bit different. Include something unexpected. You can mix textures, use contrast and emphasis, create a little bit of uniqueness within your space by using your design principles. Try to mix and match textures such as wood, velvets, linen, any fabrics, leather, and metal. Next, don't be afraid to use color. And bright color. It can lift a room to another level. I'm not saying go crazy with color, but definitely try and incorporate at least one color within your space. And lastly, play with light and dark tones. Adding a dark wall to a room instantly brings warmth and elegance and glamour into a space. A dark wall can make elements pop within a space, especially if you're using a touch of greenery. Right, so let's do a quick recap. Our project scheme is the outline and map of the direction that our project is going to take. We research, plan, and develop our project ideas to create our project scheme. A project scheme is then presented to the client. So essentially, all of your ideas are then consolidated and condensed into one document or physical board, which we then use to present to the client. Similar to the way in which you would present a project to a teacher in school on a subject, or in the way you would present a marketing proposal to a client. The next question then to be answered is, how do we start the project scheme? Where do we begin? What programs are we going to use? Don't worry, I'm going to take you all through this as I start to show you how to present your project schemes. We are going to use our office renovation project with Sophia as our example and scenario for this project. We are going to need to include everything in her project brief into our project scheme presentation. Let's take a little look at her brief. Her brief was to create an office space to accommodate 2 people. We needed to include a bathroom and a kitchen and add a new floor finish and remove existing, obviously. We needed to maximize the natural light in the space and include a contemporary minimalist theme, as well as incorporate any natural finishes that we could. When presenting the project scheme, we would show her the color scheme relating to the concept and style. We would indicate what light fittings we were wanting to use and any other detail relevant to the scheme. We would also show her a layout of furniture placement to indicate a rough space flow, which would allow Sophia to visualize how we suggest the best possible use and function of the space. It would also indicate space flow. Let's start by creating our scheme. We start by generating the layout. In your computer program of choice, you would draw up Sophia's project layout or office layout. I would then source images from Pinterest or internet or any source that you feel comfortable with. I would then start planning the space, spending some time planning the space and setting the space up. From here, I would use the images to create the feeling and mood. So you would add your mood board, sample board, space plan, and project diagrams at this point. And finally, I'd need to finalize the presentation, add any additional information you feel vital to the project. From here, I would set up a meeting with my client and I would present this document. You may even bring along a walkthrough and a 3D model of the space. I would follow this meeting up with an email version of the presentation and then request that if they don't have any changes, to sign off the document and send it back. So let's break this presentation down for Sophia. I'm going to start off by creating Sophia's layout for her proposed space. As you can see, I've got an existing plan of her space on the left-hand side and a proposed plan on the right-hand side of my screen. The proposed plan of the space is what I'm proposing the space to look like when I've completed the project. I would typically make the changes on the computer program that I was using, for example, SketchUp, AutoCAD, or Revit, and indicate any wall changes or finish changes within the space. Once your walls and furniture are in and the changes to the space have been made, I would PDF the drawing and add this to my presentation. You can include both existing and proposed space. At this point, I would also give the client a hard copy of the furniture plan to hold while I'm presenting during my presentation. This can be a fun and interactive part of your meeting with your client. Show them where you've indicated each function of the space and how you've tackled the project. We then need to create the mood board and concept board for the space. This you can almost take directly from the images that you've sourced from your concept board. Gather the images of your room that you like. They don't need to all be office images. So for Sophia's case, we don't need to only look at office images. It can be anything to do with the mood and feeling that we're wanting to create. Copy them onto your presentation and lay them out so they best convey the mood and feeling for the proposed space. I would look in places like Pinterest and Google, anything to do with images that I can find for my concept. So as you can see on your screen, I have neatly laid out all my images relating to Sophia's office. You can clearly see the warm but elegant mood that I'm wanting to create for her space and suggesting warm lighting and natural finishes. Next on the list, I need to create the design board for Sophia's project. I would add this to my presentation. The design board is much more detailed than your mood board, as you should know. Our design board is taking the images from our Pinterest site or our research sites and setting them around our plan to convey the look and feel within each room. So as you can see, it's a little bit more detailed as I'm adding notations and getting quite specific on what furniture pieces and finishes I'm adding. I have indicated the floor finish, the furniture finish, the table finishes, the lighting finishes. Everything that I'm proposing for Sophia's office space is adding to this image. It can be created on Photoshop and then brought into your PowerPoint document via JPEG or exported image. I would again try and use as much of the information that I created in the research phase and development phase of my project in this document. Next, we need to include our sample board for Sophia's office. I would have a digital sample board on the next page showing the proposed samples for the space. You can clearly see in this image the fabrics, the flooring, and the curtaining that I'm proposing, as well as the hints of gold, aluminium, and metalwork. I've also packed a really nice bag of samples to bring with me to my client meeting. Next, we need to add our detail and 3D visuals to better enhance the quality of our presentation. Because remember, we need to communicate our ideas in the best possible way to ensure that the client has a visible and realistic idea of what we're proposing, which will help them buy into the idea of the project. And last but not least, typically one would include the project scope. In this case, our project scope is very rough as we've not covered yet how to create our project scope for our projects. But we'll look at this in more detail in Module 3 and 4. For now, I've listed a rough idea of what you can expect in the project scope and what we're required to do as designers during this project. And that covers that. But before we finish, let's just do a quick recap of some of the programs that I've used during this process. So I started out by creating my layouts, and I've done this in AutoCAD, but you can use SketchUp, Revit, or any other computer-aided software program. Then we created our mood boards and design boards, and to do this I used Pinterest to gather my information, and then I've used PowerPoint to create the template, but you can also use Photoshop or Illustrator, and again, whatever program you prefer. We then created our scope of work. So I've created my scope of works in Excel, but you can also do a very rough scope of works in PowerPoint. And lastly, we have our 3D rendering. So I've done my 3D renders in SketchUp, but you can use AutoCAD, Revit, or even hand drawings, whichever preference you have. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. Let's do a recap of what you've just covered so that we're all on the same page. Firstly, we started off by defining the design scheme. So by now, you should all know what a design scheme is. We then looked at all the elements that make up a design scheme, so how to put your design scheme together. We looked at the various programs that you can use to develop and create your very own design scheme. And lastly, we looked at how to create our own design scheme presentations. This is where we took Sophia's office renovation as an example. This was an exciting but extremely important lesson when it comes to the fundamentals of interior design. I hope that you've enjoyed this journey, and if you need to, please go back and recap this lesson. And that brings us to the challenge for today's lesson. You are going to create your own design boards for your client, Sophia. This I suggest you create in PowerPoint for the time being, or any other program that you feel most comfortable with. Re-watch this lesson to ensure that you've included everything that you need to on your design boards. The plan of Sophia's space will also be provided in your summary notes. Your concept, remember, is a minimalist contemporary office space, and I would suggest including accent color of your choice. So you could include a mustard yellow or a green, whatever accent color you feel like bringing into the space. Please include your sketches or whatever you can in terms of visual imagery to get the feeling and mood of the contemporary minimalist design across to the client. Create your mood boards and post them to Instagram and Facebook so that I can see where you are and what you're all doing. For today's lesson, you can use the hashtag ID Challenge M2L5 because we're in Module 2 of Lesson 5. Before we end off today's lesson, let's just take a quick sneak peek at your skill progression thus far. So as you can see, we have really progressed very nicely since our Module 1. Our critical thinking and history, fundamentals, and style of design have really solidified. We've then looked at our elements and principles, which we've really skyrocketed on. And then in today's lesson and last week's lesson, we looked at presentational design. So we looked at understanding, we applied it, and we executed our design in our challenge. Our professional practice is starting to creep in as we're looking at presentational design and how to present to the client, as well as when to get your documents signed off. Our computer-aided software we haven't quite touched on yet, although as we've gone along through our lessons, we have a little bit of an understanding of what software can be used in what process and in what instance. So that's your skill progression for today's lesson. I'm very impressed with how far we've got, and I hope you are too. I'm sure most of you are aware by now that these lessons are brand new to Shaw Academy. You are the first students to be taking this course in interior design, and some of the first students to be taking this course in Module 2. A very exciting time, but please remember, we're working as hard as we can to create these lessons and get them out to you as fast as we possibly can. If you are waiting for a lesson to come out, please have a look at some of the other courses that we offer at Shaw Academy. We offer great social media courses and a variety of brand new courses. Thank you for being so patient thus far, and I hope you're enjoying this interior design module. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson, Lesson 5 of your Module 2. Well done for getting this far. We are more than halfway through our second module with the promise of only more exciting things to follow. So keep up the hard work and see you for Lesson 6. Happy learning, everyone.